a man could live alone and never think it wrong if the November wind didn't sing such lonesome songs. A line from a Rod McEwen poem called The Far West and published in his collection Listen to the Warm. Hello once again, I'm Don Jackson. The wind does bring with it a different melody as the aging year runs down. The cold north wind seems to play a melancholy refrain to those who must take their leave from the ones they love. Its icy breath seems to whisper that it's time to go. These then are a few of those lonesome songs. Christina Georgina Rossetti was the one who wrote, "Who has seen the wind? Neither you nor I. But when the trees bow down their heads, the wind is passing by." I've often spoken of our connection to the wind. The words of Rod McEwen lend a certain amount of credence to this connection. He wrote, and I quote, "I have loved the wind when it brought blooms and blossoms, smells through an open window, when it changed the wind's direction, when I caught it on the quietest of days, rearranging and playing with a crowd of clouds." End quote. From the author's note in the book Watch for the Wind, a biplane book published by Pocket Books, again he wrote, "Most winds, unless they tie up with a hurricane or travel with tornadoes, are personal by nature." End quote. In the book Weather, Understanding the Forces of Nature by Louise Quayle was this story, and I quote, "In 582, Parisians were terrified when the mighty Scirocco swept across the Sahara and over Europe, bringing tons of red sand. It was described as a shower of blood, which the populace was convinced had been sent down upon them as punishment for their sins." End quote. There is no denying that those winds that have as their nurseries the parched, desolate regions of the world are ill winds. And whatever the character of the wind, it lends itself to the mood of those who get in its way. It was the writer George Eliot who said, "Certain winds will make men's temper bad." This appeared in an article by Peter Steinhardt from the March 1988 issue of Audubon. He writes, "Everyone agrees, however, that dry winds like the Santa Ana, the Mistral in France, and the Föhn in Germany and Switzerland appear to have negative effects on our mental and physical well-being." End quote. November is referred to as the wind month. A UPI writer once said, "Indian summer is now only a memory as the wind bites harder." Pods of summer crowd around the door. I take them in the autumn of my hands. Last night I heard the first cold wind outside, and wind blew soft, and yet I shivered twice. Once for thin walls, once for the sound of time. William Stafford from a collection called Traveling Through the Dark. A brief page of autumn that, like fragile, brown November leaves, fly in the wind. Gabriella Mistral wrote, "The errant wind in the night cradles the wheat. Listening to the winds in love, I cradle my sweet. I heard them cry, the peacocks. Was it a cry against the twilight or against the leaves themselves, turning in the wind, turning as the flames turned in the fire? The words of Wallace Stevens from 1923's Domination of Black. All that autumn is can be learned from one dry, single leaf turning in the wind. William Cullen Bryant wrote, "When shrieked the bleak November winds and smote the woods, and the brown fields were herbless, and the shades that met above the merry rivulet were spoiled, I sought and loved them still. Those who hear traces of a song that whisper in the wind watch and wait for a return of yesterday. The wind is elusive, though, slipping through fingers, impossible to hold on to, as easy to clutch as it is to grasp the moonlight. Those who hope for the return of the one who got away with the wind may have a long time to wait, for the wind is changeable, never content to follow a predictable course, always finding new pleasures to pursue. And then there are November winds." Richard Henry Stoddard wrote, "The wild November comes at last beneath a veil of rain. The night wind blows its folds aside. Her face is full of pain." Willa Sibbert Gather wrote, "Something soft and wild and free, something that whispered to the ear on the pillow, lightened the heart. Softly, softly picked the lock, slid the bolts, and released the prison spirit of man into the wind." This is Love's Secret by William Blake. He wrote, "Never seek to tell thy love, love that never told shall be. For the gentle wind does move silently, invisibly. I told my love, I told my love, I told her all my heart, trembling, cold, in ghastly fears. Ah, she did depart. Soon after she was gone from me, a traveler came by. Silently, invisibly, he took her with a sigh." That kind of wind is more common than you might think. Emily Dickinson wrote about the wind's visit, and again I quote, "The wind tapped like a tired man, and like a host, 'Come in,' I boldly answered. Entered then my residence within, a rapid, footless guest, to offer whom a chair were as impossible as hand a sofa to the air. No bone had he to bind him. His speech was like the push of numerous hummingbirds at once from a superior bush. His countenance a billow, his fingers, if he pass, let go of music, as of tunes blown tremulous in glass. He visited, still flitting. Then, like a timid man, again he tapped. 'Twas flurriedly, and I became alone." The young man took a last frightened look at the eastern sky and bolted the shutters. I've only been in these waters a few months. What happens in a typhoon? The supreme winds come out of the gale against you. What are they? Gusts? Squalls? Sometimes they're called the devil winds. A few lines from a classic novel of love and adventure on the island we know today as Hong Kong. The book is Taipan by James Clavell. From that point in the story, you're taken literally through the tempest and into the hurricane's eye. A typhoon actually comes from the word typhoon and literally translated means wind that strikes. And that is putting it mildly. We've seen the damage that a super typhoon can wreak upon a people. The images from the Philippines are horrific. I can't imagine what it must have been like to be in the path of Haiyan. Just before boarding a cruise ship for a trip around the Florida Keys, across the Caribbean and to Cancun, and then back again with a group of my former listeners from Montreal, I visited a marine museum outside Miami. At the time, there was an exhibit that allowed you to experience what it is like to be in a hurricane. I walked through a door and felt raindrops. From hidden speakers, I could hear the roar that accompanies the storm, like a train with its throttle stuck wide open. The hut was being buffeted by these winds that strike, as Clavell described them. I must admit, I was glad to walk out the other side. My clothes were damp from the exhibit's realism, but it was just too eerie an experience considering where that museum is located. In hindsight, I consider it ironic to have a museum like this in South Florida, where the residents are often in the storm's path for real. They need no simulator to know what it feels like. In the book called Weather, Understanding the Forces of Nature by Louise Quayle, she also writes, and again I quote, "An Australian, Clement Wragg, began the practice during the early 20th century by naming hurricanes after people he liked." End quote. I wonder what he would have named after people he didn't like. Do you know what singer was named after a song in the musical Paint Your Wagon? She is Mariah Carey and was named for the song They Call the Wind Mariah. It is interesting to note that in the Bible, in Revelation 7:1, there is mention of 4 angels of the wind. These angels are posted at the gates of the north, south, east, and west winds. Gustav Davidson, in his book A Dictionary of Angels, said the 4 angels have been identified as Raphael for the west wind, Uriel for the southern wind, Michael for the eastern wind, and Gabriel controlling the north wind. You know, that might better explain this truth about the wind. Peter Steinhardt, who wrote that piece on the wind for the March '88 issue of Audubon, said, and I quote, "For wind is a plant's only chance to make music. To listen long to the wind is to know the voice of the plants, that pines have a high-pitched whine, that oaks groan, grass sighs, and redwoods sing softly." End quote. This is a poem by George H. Miles. It is called Said the Rose. "I am weary of the garden," said the rose, "for the winter winds are sighing, all my playmates round me dying, and my leaves will soon be lying 'neath the snows. But I hear my mistress coming," said the rose, She will take me to her chamber where the honeysuckles clamber, and I'll bloom there all December, spite the snows. Sweeter fell her lily finger than the bee. Ah, how feebly I resisted, smoothed my thorns, and e'en assisted, as all blushing I was twisted off my tree. And she fixed me in her bosom like a star, and I flashed there all the morning, jasmine, honeysuckle scorning, parasites forever fawning that they are. And when the evening came, she set me in a vase, all of rare and radiant metal, and I felt her red lips settle on my leaves till each proud petal touched her face. And I shone about her slumbers like a light, and I said, instead of weeping, in the garden vigil keeping, here I'll watch my mistress sleeping every night. But when morning with its sunbeams softly shone in the mirror where she braided her brown hair, I saw how jaded, old, and colorless and faded I had grown. Not a drop of dew was on me, never one. From my leaves no odor started, all my perfume had departed. I lay pale and broken-hearted in the sun. Still, I said, her smile is better than the rain. Though my fragrance may forsake me, to her bosom she will take me, and with crimson kisses make me young again. So she took me, gazed a second, half a sigh. Then, alas, can hearts so harden? Without ever asking pardon, threw me back into the garden, there to die. How the jealous garden gloried in my fall, how the honeysuckle chid me, how the sneering jasmines bid me light the long grass that hid me like a pall. There I lay beneath her window in a swoon, till the earthworm o'er me trailing woke me just at twilight's failing, as the whippoorwill was wailing to the moon. But I hear the storm winds stirring in their lair, and I know they soon will lift me in their giant arms and sift me into ashes as they drift me through the air. So I pray them in their mercy just to take from my heart of hearts, or near it, the last living leaf, and bear it to her feet, and bid her wear it for my sake. Homer in the Iliad wrote, "A generation of men is like a generation of leaves. The wind scatters some leaves upon the ground, while others the burgeoning wood brings forth, and the season of spring comes on. So of men one generation springs forth, and another ceases. The leaves of memory in the mind flip back, as if some wind has caught their corners. Then he descended the steps of the temple, and all the people followed him. And he reached his ship and stood upon the deck. And facing the people again, he raised his voice and said, 'People of Orphalese, the wind bids me leave you. Less hasty am I than the wind, yet I must go. We wanderers, ever seeking the lonelier way, begin no day where we have ended another day, and no sunrise finds us where sunset left us. Even while the earth sleeps, we travel. We are the seeds of the tenacious plant, and it is in our ripeness and our fullness of heart that we are given to the wind and are scattered.'" Some lines later, the author continues, "So saying, he made a signal, and straightway they weighed anchor and cast the ship loose from its moorings, and they moved eastward. And a cry came from the people as from a single heart, and it rose into the dusk and was carried out over the sea like a great trumpeting. Only Elmitra was silent, gazing after the ship until it had vanished into the mist. and when all the people were dispersed, she still stood alone upon the seawall, remembering in her heart his saying, "A little while, a moment of rest upon the wind, and another woman shall bear me." Excerpts from The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. November sings a silent song and goes about its business of preparing and clearing the way for winter. Good night, sweet dreams. I'm Don Jackson.